Welcome to AOT for Allegheny County's first webinar. I'm your host, Ruth Johnston. I'm a writer and mother who lives in northern Allegheny County. Treating severe brain illness is not a fun topic, but it's my topic because more than 10 years ago, my oldest son developed paranoid schizophrenia on top of high-functioning autism. Because of legal barriers to getting him into treatment, we were not able to prevent a tragedy. Pennsylvania law let us down first when we couldn't force him into treatment against his choice, and it let us down again when it sent him to prison for 20 years. We may reference my story as we talk, but if you want to read about what happened, you can go to my website, www.aot4alleghenycounty.com. That's with 4 spelled out, not as a numeral. AOT4alleghenycounty.com, where I tell the story and have more information. Pennsylvania law now allows for a civil court order to mandate medical treatment. But because every county has to choose to design a program for it, there's no place in the state that yet offers this option. I want Allegheny County to be the first to help families find treatment before tragedy by opting in on the law as soon as possible. My guest is Frankie Berger, who was very involved in negotiating the law back in 2016 and 17. I met Frankie just after the law had passed, and she told me the story of how it came to be. The story is important because it's a good way of looking at our law's strengths and weaknesses. So, hi, Frankie.
Hi.
Frank Berger. And
It's so good to be here.
Good. I'm really glad. And I was so glad that we had that conversation back in 2017, because then I knew that it was, when you're not involved in how laws are made, you either make a joke about it, like it's making sausages, or else you just kind of, well, it's just somebody writes it and everyone says, okay. And it's not at all like that, of course. And so it really helped that I learned the story back then. So want to tell people what kind of background brings somebody into the work of helping negotiate a law like that? What have you done in other
Yeah, it's been a strange journey. So I've always been on the government and policy side of things, even since high school. I went to a high school for government relations. And so,
Oh, wow.
yeah, I kind of knew I wanted to be in this world forever. And my first real job was working on Capitol Hill. So I worked for a conservative Democrat from Western North Carolina, and I had a portfolio of issues there. My education is as an economist, and I barely use that, although people pull me into those kinds of conversations, whether I like it or not,
Okay.
throughout my career. But yeah, I started on Capitol Hill, and then I ended up doing finance, which included housing finance. And so then I worked with Habitat for Humanity, actually, and that took me off the Hill, and I went to go work for them in their policy and government affairs shop, and did for years. And then I followed my boss to the Treatment Advocacy Center, which is honestly where I did the most important work of my career, and I think it will be the most important work of my career moving forward. And so the Treatment Advocacy Center, for you all who might not be familiar with it, is a national nonprofit in Arlington, Virginia, but their remit is just to go in and try and change policies and laws that increase access for people with serious mental illness to treatment. And that's a huge problem that we face all over the country. And so that is really where we focused 100% of our efforts. And that's where I came to do this work. And while I did lobby for this bill, I've never officially been a lobbyist, so I've never actually been registered. I'm more on the policy side of things.
Okay.
Yeah, so problem solving.
Yeah. I met Treatment Advocacy Center when our family tragedy took place about 2 months after the Sandy Hook shooting.
Yeah.
And of course, that was a horrific thing. And a lot of lawmakers started working on thinking about what to do and so on. And So a couple people from treatment advocacy wrote articles that
Yes.
appeared in things that I read. And so I remembered the name. So when I found myself on February 19th, I'll skip to the next day, February 20th, waking up and the tragedy was over. The first thing I did, literally like at 6 in the morning, is I looked up the names I remembered and I found where they were from and I looked up the phone number and I just called it and said, I want to talk to somebody. And I think the director at the time, Brian Stetton, as the minute he came into the office and heard his messages, he called me. And I just, so he was one of the first people I talked to. I was really still in shock. And I told him about it and I said, I want to make something good come out of this. And there wasn't at that time any direct path. It's not like you would say, okay, here's what you need to do. It's like, well, you could write an article for us. You can get to know people. And I just gradually did. And what I began to learn is that vowing to change the law is, no, it's not a very prudent vow, is it? Because it's awfully hard to do. You know, I remember standing there.
It's out of your control.
It's out of your control. And so I remember thinking like, well, what do I do? I don't know, let's get some information. And so at some point early on, Treatment Advocacy Center connected me to Taylor Andrews, who's an attorney in Harrisburg. He knows a lot of the legislators. He's right there. And so as an outsider, kind of naive, you think to yourself, oh, that's the guy that can get it done. He had a son with schizophrenia, and so he really understood. And you're like, yeah, he'll just get it done. And no, it's not like that either. And it really began to seem like a hopeless situation, which is I think where you came into the picture.
I think so many folks were in a similar boat to you and to Taylor Andrews, and just you realize it doesn't matter how many resources you have. I mean, unless you're a billionaire, but even then with serious mental illness, you can't do
Yeah,
anything. It
that's
doesn't
right.
matter. And it
Right.
doesn't matter how well resourced or how well connected you are. And we saw that again and again. And
Mm-hmm.
what was particularly bad about Pennsylvania and so intractable is that your civil commitment standards in the Commonwealth were the most strict in the entire country. And they still are for inpatient
Wow.
civil commitment. And that's because it required, and imagine this, for both inpatient and outpatient civil commitment, there was AOT on the books, but it had the same criteria of a clear
Right.
and present danger standard.
That's right.
And the clear and present danger standard, just to put a fine point on that for you all, in Pennsylvania was defined as like within the last 30 days, you had to
Mm-hmm.
almost successfully try to kill yourself.
Or someone
Um,
else.
Yes. So you had to be a
But
clear and present
right.
danger to yourself or others. But for the self standard, it was you have to have actively, and you have to be able to prove the person actively tried to commit
Wow.
suicide. You have to prove that they tried to mutilate or successfully mutilated themselves. This is one of the standards. Or they have to be so sick that there's a reasonable probability that they
Yeah.
will die within 30 days.
Within 30, yeah, it was events 30 days ago and
Wild.
what you can predict 30 days ahead. That was that, and still is. I'm saying was,
Still is.
it is.
Still is. And you have to have really tried to commit serious bodily harm to someone else, or successfully done that
We
to meet that inpatient criteria.
we got my son Levi inpatient once because he had an idea that he'd been talking to an angel, and the angel said, remember when Abraham was to sacrifice Isaac? Would you be willing to sacrifice yourself? So he took a knife and he just sort of drew, it's just like a thin red line. It looked like ink, which he was also the kind of guy that would, draw on his skin with permanent marker pretty often. And so but no, it was a very light, it wasn't even close to harming him, literally.
Yeah.
But he did it. And that meant that when we called the Resolve team to come out and talk to him, they said that, because it was visible and the red was blood, not ink. And then after that, he got a case manager who met with him at the house and said to him, I got to tell you how to stay out of the hospital. Make sure that you never do the following things. And I'm saying,
Oof.
what? And he just looks at me and goes, he has a right to know how to stay out of the hospital. And I said, but
Is that really the point?
is that really the point? Exactly, exactly. At that point, right. And it was very frustrating to people who knew the family, and knew what was going on, because one of my son's delusions was that my mother in her 70s had tried to kill him. He was absolutely certain that this had happened. And he would tell anybody, yeah, this is what she did, and I chased her away, and da, 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 da. So this was kind of obvious that this was not going to be a good situation in the home. And
Yes.
but it didn't matter because he believed she had tried to kill him. There was no visible mark, as you say, there was no mutilation. He was not making threats.
The warning signs were all there,
Oh,
bright
they're
and
all
clear.
there. It's yeah, he explains. We'll see her spirit is gone from her body, and there's just an evil spirit living in her, and she's trying to poison your food, and this kind of thing. It was obvious that we were going cruising for a problem, but because it didn't meet exact, clear and present danger, it
Yeah.
didn't. And that
Now
was
imagine the fact that that standard applies to outpatient civil commitment as well. So would you,
exactly,
that's negligence to put someone
exactly,
who's a clear and present danger in the community like that.
exactly.
It's
If
not,
they're clear and present danger, they should be inpatient.
yes, they should be
Right.
inpatient. I
Yeah.
mean, that kind of criteria is ridiculous. And
Yeah.
so we
Right.
needed to figure out another way in. And what had actually happened historically in Pennsylvania was there was an AOT bill that kept getting introduced and introduced and
Mhm.
introduced for
Mhm.
years.
I think
But
Taylor Andrews was involved with that, I'm sure.
absolutely, and quite a few folks were, and it was being introduced by a senator who was on the Judiciary Committee, so in his realm of jurisdiction in the courts.
I
But
almost
it was
remember.
taking New York's law verbatim and trying to implement that in Pennsylvania, which, as you all know, in
I see.
Pennsylvania will never work. And so what we did in 2016, 2017, and then eventually got it over the finish line in 2018 was we completely scrapped that and looked at what the law looks like right now, at the time in 2016. What does the law look like right now? How do we put this into the existing law, the existing words, the existing structures that are already there in this space for people in Pennsylvania? And so we reworked the law, and if you ever looked it up and you see it in situ, like in the statute itself,
Mhm.
it's seamless, it's seamlessly integrated into the
Yeah,
existing
that's
commitment
right.
law. Right.
Right.
So that was the avenue that we that
Right.
we ultimately pursued.
So, but the big difference with AOT is in the clear and present danger standard.
Yep.
Is it safe to say that there's no AOT law in the country that still sticks with a standard like that? My
Oh, not even close. Not,
Yeah,
no, 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 because it's seen as something that is really cruel and dangerous. If you're putting
I
somebody
know
who
it.
you have determined to be dangerous in the community, then that's awful to them and to other people. And so, no, you don't see that anywhere else. You all were the outliers for a very long time. And honestly, there's something tricky too about Pennsylvania, and it's because you have the Mental Health Procedures Act that's been in existence since 1976, which
Mhm.
predates me by a little bit. And that has
I
not
remember
been
1976.
substantively really changed since then. And so there have been attempts to try and modernize that over the
Yeah,
years, but it is incredibly difficult to open that up in any capacity, which this ultimately did, it had to do.
had to do.
But that is a barrier in itself that doesn't exist necessarily in other states.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
kind of like in a sense, by writing a law at all, they set up something that I think Massachusetts is in the same situation where they had a sort of a thing that was supposed to be help out with the kind of problem we're talking about. And because of that, they keep saying, no, we don't need a change in the law. And so they're going to end up being the 50th state to adopt an AOT law if they ever do. So
Yes.
um yeah, and just to make clear, I guess we're kind of start getting into talking about the story, but also trying to define AOT and the idea and why it's needed. And
Yep.
going back to my story, we lived so clearly with why it's needed because my son would have, he changed in a number of ways. You know, the people he used to be like to be around, he was afraid of them. Sometimes he couldn't understand when I spoke to him. He would say, "What?" And he didn't understand various things that used to be easy for him. There were a lot of changes, and he seemed to be unaware of them. As far as he knew,
Yeah.
he wasn't, and he wasn't a depressed schizophrenic. He was a happy schizophrenic. He wasn't really afraid. He wasn't really worried that the CIA was spying on him. Um, he believed that he had a mission to help the angels. He was in the angelic army. And in fact, he'd risen to being second in command. And he and the Archangel Michael were going to conquer evil in the world. And he had a little checklist of all the kinds of evil they had already conquered. And they were going to get down to the last one. And then he told me, "You won't need food. All disease will go away. It'll be great. You're just going to love it." And nothing could dislodge that. He'd been untreated. It had probably been 4 years anyway that he really should have been on treatment, and he found ways
Yeah.
not to make that happen. And so he just didn't even know. And if you said to him, "Levi, look, you need treatment," he'd say, "Why are you persecuting me for my religious beliefs?" Every time. That's what he'd be like, "Mom, I have religious freedom, you know?" And so he just didn't see it. No matter what you said, he just didn't see it. And the interesting thing about that is that a lot of people don't understand if they haven't seen it firsthand with a family member, is that that's not what we call denial. Like that's not the whole river in Egypt joke thing. They're not in denial. What they have is the part of the brain that monitors the brain is broken. In the same way that there's a part of your brain that can tell whether you're standing up straight or not. You can tell, you know, if I don't know, various things. You can tell if you're awake, you can tell if you're thinking. Something in that was broken so that he just couldn't tell. If
And it's so common that that lack of insight
That's
is,
what it is.
yeah, it comes along with a lot of these more
Mm-hmm.
serious mental
Mm-hmm.
illnesses.
Yeah, and that's what basically Pennsylvania law doesn't allow for anything between in the gap that develops there. So if he had been making threats, and incidentally, the law said threats with an S. I remember one of the things Taylor Andrews tried to change was just making it threat.
You would think that would be enough.
Couldn't get that change made, no. But between the violence standard and where he was, where he just didn't see, there was just nothing. And because he was not basically a violent person, he was really he was sweet. I don't know, he was kind of passive. He was high functioning autistic. And it was strange that he even, I mean, basically, I'm kind of sort of beating around the bush, and I don't mean to do that. In February 2013, he suddenly killed my mother. It was not anything like a typical murder. It was mental illness all the way. I
Oh.
mean, when you just walk up to a couple of people and stab one of them and then just stand there and say, "Okay, I'm going to go back to my video game now," that's not sanity. So anyway, it didn't make sense. And there was no warning between the other stuff and this. And that's the key problem with clear and present danger. It wasn't clear and
Too late. It's too late when you hit,
yeah,
yeah, it's
that's
too late.
right. It wasn't clear and present until right then.
Yep.
And he used to say, "I wouldn't kill anybody. I'd hate to see harm, to see somebody wounded and I caused it. That's horrifying. I wouldn't want to do that." Um, I know for a little while during prison, he had forgotten why he was there. I haven't asked him, but it's been hard for him to hold it in his mind that he actually did that because it's so different from who he is. Um, anyway, and that's what the law is not providing for. So what other things were going on in his life? Well, a couple times he called 911 because he drove to a store like Walmart and his car was stolen.
Hmm.
And the police would come and walk around with him and they'd say, "Oh, this looks like your license plate right here." And he'd say, "Oh, I guess my car wasn't stolen. Thank you." And just weird things like that. He became kind of childish. The one time he sat outside in the snow, avoiding holiday guests who were his favorite cousins that he'd grown up with, and they were right there. And he chose to sit outside in the snow and talk to aliens. And his blood sugar dropped. He didn't eat. He wasn't warm enough. This is somebody who had done wilderness survival training and Native American crafts and skills when he was a teenager. He knew all about how to take care of himself in the cold weather, and he just didn't do it. And he ended up breaking some bones and falling down the stairs. And those things, with a different standard that's not clear and present danger, those things could have been put on a petition. Maybe some of the things, I mean, he said lots of crazy things. I've given you a few samples. And friends would say, "Well, do you have it in writing? Because if it's in writing, you could show that to a judge." And I'm going, that's not how it works.
That's not how it
It's
works.
not how it works. It doesn't make any difference what we show anybody. And they'd say, "How is this possible? That this year he's talking about the end of the world and his angelic power and all this." No, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So basically, we had evidence that he was coming to misunderstand the world, not take care of himself, make mistakes. He really should have had his license taken away. That would have been the next thing. The next big fight would have been saying that you can't drive. In any case, so the whole point of an AOT law is to set up something where those kinds of evidence would be relevant.
Yeah, and I can go through what that AOT criteria is
Yeah.
because I don't want to mince words, or I want to make sure that folks understand what that means for.
Let's say briefly what it is, and then after we go through your story, I want to take a little more time and talk about the exactly the provisions of the law. But yeah, go ahead and
Absolutely. So to your point, like the criteria for an assisted outpatient treatment, which is AOT order,
mhm,
is inability to survive safely without supervision. And that
mhm.
would have, you hit that several times
Yeah,
with
exactly.
Levi. Non-adherence to treatment history that leads to bad outcomes, right? So you know he hadn't been adherent and he
He's
had bad outcomes.
he was going to UPMC's outpatient treatment for psychosis, and every time he went in, they told him you need to be on meds, and he'd say, "I don't think so." So yeah, we had
See,
that.
this is also good. So another criteria is unlikely to voluntarily seek treatment or to be able to substantively
Right.
adhere to a treatment plan.
Definitely
And
one.
that's pivotal for AOT,
Mhm.
which we'll get to at some point, how
Right,
this
right.
actually structurally works, but also that there's a risk of harm through relapse. So based on the treatment history and the non-adherence,
Right.
that relapse is inevitable because you can see it
Mhm.
through history. You can look back through time and see what the writing on the wall looks like.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you knew it, your family knew it,
Right.
everybody but Levi knew it, and there was
That's
nothing
right.
you could do.
That's right.
And so this would help.
All of the county staff we came in contact with, they knew it, but they said there's nothing we can do. And they would say, something has to happen. Nothing can change. And you just have to hope that what happens isn't very bad. And as it turned
Exactly
out,
right.
it was.
Yeah, it's the worst thing that could have happened. And
Yeah, yeah, we lost two people that day because my son, high functioning autistic people in prison do not thrive, let's put it that way. And so
I
it's
can't
been,
even imagine
yeah,
what that did to
it's
your
a
family.
story for another day, but it's it's been bad. So if there had been a program and he had, then basically just to kind of recap, he would have gotten a civil court order, not a criminal one, a civil court order and a team to work with. And then it would have been his responsibility to work with the team and their responsibility to make sure, and then checking in with the court. That's the basic gist of AOT. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think an important, like perhaps to me, one of the most important parts of AOT, because you have a court, you have a civil court order, like you're
Mm-hmm.
saying. So there's a
Mm-hmm.
civil court judge, it cannot be punitive, nobody can be held in
Right.
contempt of court, but with that AOT order comes a treatment plan that is well-defined, and it has a treatment team that's now attached to Levi, for example.
Right.
And the court requires both parties to adhere to the treatment plan. So they're actually requiring that provider in the community
Right.
to provide treatment and services to your son. Right now, there's nothing requiring them to do that at all.
Right. I
And
mean,
so that's a really important
yeah.
part.
He asked for a case manager, but that was more like, I think that was like a Medicaid kind of thing. And there wasn't any expertise with mental illness. And when he would go and to his outpatient appointments at UPMC's STEP program, they would chat with him a bit and tell him things, and he would just simply come home again. And as far as he was concerned, he was complying with going to the appointments. What more did I
Yeah,
want?
and there's more to
And they didn't
compliance to a
offer him
treatment
anything
plan.
more. Hmm?
Right. Right. They can't, not without this kind of
Right.
intervention.
Right.
But what he needs and what would be provided by definition through an AOT order would be those wraparound services. So an assisted community treatment team,
Yeah.
like that ACT team, which is focused
Uh-huh.
specifically on people living with serious mental
Yeah.
illness. And that's everything. That's even transportation for
Mm-hmm.
him. Like that's the whole
I see.
thing. And
Right. Right.
something like that or equivalent to that has to be provided
And in
through the order.
in a sense, we were stumbling toward that because Pittsburgh has a mobile crisis team called Resolve. And so we ended up just calling Resolve a lot. And there were a couple times we didn't know what to do with him. He didn't meet hospital criteria, but maybe he thought that someone was trying to kill him. And he would agree to just go down and stay at their walk-in center. And they had some rooms and he would just stay there. It wasn't locked or anything. They'd give him some meals and they'd see him each day, they'd tell him he needed on meds. So we ended up, in a sense, using Resolve to create a wraparound service that didn't exist. And
Yeah.
I'm sure that Dr. Roselle, the head of Resolve, has a lot of thoughts about how it happens that one person begins using the services too much because there isn't a service somewhere else. And that's one of the things that people always have to keep in mind is that when you pay for AOT, the need is going to go down in other places. Anyway, so here's the big question. You're hired at TAC, and why wouldn't anyone in Pennsylvania jump at the chance to have a program like this? And yet you're given
And
sort
yet,
of jurisdiction over several states, and Pennsylvania's one of them, and they tell you to quit before you even started. What did they say?
yeah, so I was director of advocacy, which was over the whole country. So I had a bird's eye
Okay.
view into what was going
Oh,
on
wow.
across all the states and with the federal government at the time, which was its own uh, disaster in some ways.
Right.
But and so you see the states and you can see above and you can see what's going on. And Pennsylvania was such a critical need. It was so bad. And so on my first list of to-dos was figure out and fix what's going on in Pennsylvania because it's so unconscionable that that was the standard. Inpatient and outpatient civil
Yeah.
commitment. Like that's
Yeah.
just unacceptable to me as a
Yeah.
person who cares about this. And so I brought it to the board because I had to bring a plan to the board. Like, what's my plan of action? How am I going to work on stuff and where am I going to prioritize? And I said, Pennsylvania's at the top of my list. They literally kind of like guffawed, like they laughed around the table and kind of like stroked their beards. And they're like, yes, we've been here for many years and nothing's happened because it's so bad, because that Mental Health Procedures Act is such a locked box, because a lot of the counties are not they're not necessarily mentally oriented towards doing this kind of thing. There's a lot of different concerns. There's a lot of different questions. There's a lot of hesitation because not a whole lot has changed in decades there.
Mhm.
And so, you know, I truly believe they're trying to do their best with what they've got, but this was another tool that could help them do
Right.
better for patients.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I kind of said, cool, I hear you, but I'm going to do this. Like, I have to do this. But I had a board member on the tech board at the time, he's still there, who is a Pennsylvania resident, and his son is pretty sick. And he was like, let's do it. I know a bunch of people in Pennsylvania. I know a great guy on the ground who can help get into some of these offices and
Oh,
meetings,
good.
which I
Good.
did. I mean, that was like
Right.
really critical to have someone on the ground who understands how
And
to navigate that system.
that's something I
Um,
wouldn't have been able at, at the time I would have been thrilled to help, but you'd have to know, especially because so much of Pennsylvania's population and political power is in the East. You'd have to
yep,
know a lot of
absolutely,
people
yes.
there and of all the ends. So he was able to give you that.
Yeah, and it's relationships. I mean, whether you like it or not, politics and all of that is navigating relationships. Plus, I'm not from Pennsylvania, so there's a legitimacy aspect that you would carry, but I certainly don't, coming in as an outsider from DC.
Right.
And so to have somebody that can really lay the foundation and already has that trust built up across all these different folks. Like, I was looking back on the people that we met with to try and get this
Yeah.
done, and just at the highest level, right? To go through really quickly what this took.
Mhm.
This was Governor Wolf's office who ultimately ended up signing this
Okay.
into law. But Governor Wolf, lots of legislators, the health committees and the judiciary committees, the leaders of those committees, the county mental health directors, the secretary of the health department, the Department of Corrections, and lots of, we met with all the mental health advocates like Disability Rights, who really
All
don't
right.
like this at all.
Right. Right.
Mental Health Pennsylvania, that also
Oh,
doesn't
yeah.
love this very much. And NAMI Southwest Pennsylvania, which is a
Which,
key actor, but they also
but
don't like this very much.
that's
Um,
one of this. I mean, that's a whole nother topic, but how NAMI, which was founded by parents like me with concerns like mine, to the
yep.
point where people used to, I guess for a while they were making fun of them and saying it was the NAMI mommies. And
Yeah,
then,
I like to think it was a term of endearment.
well, I'd be happy to be called a NAMI mommy and that, if that were the case. But and then I guess as their kids grew up and started to do better, they joined NAMI, and gradually NAMI starts having this, I don't know, whatever term you, consumer, client, peer, basically people, not the people outside who are saying we need to get help, but the person who's being helped. And they started joining it. And I'm sure some of them agreed with their parents, but a certain number of them did not agree with their parents. And they've successfully swung NAMI's poll around to where NAMI would oppose this. If there's NAMI Southwest PA, I have not talked to them, but if I do end up, no doubt they'll be saying, "Oh no, we don't think this is a good idea," and that's just polar
They were
opposite
a
of the way it used
challenge,
to be.
yeah, at the time. But I should say, like, yes, that has happened where NAMI has kind of, now they exist in this strange spot where they're serving a couple of different masters, right? And so
Right,
they do
right,
have a consumer angle, which are the
yeah,
folks that are being treated for mental health conditions or living with mental health
mhm,
conditions, and then their caregivers, care partners,
mhm,
which are their parents typically. And
right,
yeah, they are trying to figure out how to make that work, and that's been going on for over, a decade and a half now, and it's been a challenge for the national one. But then
yeah,
you've got all these local NAMIs, like NAMI Southwest Pennsylvania is a
right,
local NAMI.
yeah,
Some of
yeah,
them are so powerful, and they're powerful in their communities, and they're powerful in their policy making, and they're powerful wherever. And some of them are not. Some of them are little mom and pop shops of like family to family meetings, and those are of
mhm,
critical importance. But you see this range of NAMIs now that are out there,
mhm,
and some of them are very consumer run and oriented, and some of them are still NAMI mommies. And
right,
it's like, how do you tap
yeah,
in and mobilize the folks that are still
yeah, yeah,
oriented with this concern in mind? Because there's also a lot of folks that um, like this very hard to treat serious mental illness population versus a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, a lot of other things that are also a mental health concern that now NAMI as an umbrella is trying to handle. But that
Right.
serious mental illness is a really tricky spot, and still I think TAC
Right.
is the only folks that are really still concentrating on that patient population.
The only that's at that size. There are some people who used to be involved with NAMI, who are trying to form another group they're calling a National Shattering Silence Coalition.
Oh, that's so
Just-
good.
Yeah, to start
Yeah.
speaking and specifically saying, let's shatter the silence around the severe things. It's much easier to talk about test anxiety. You know, it's not
Yeah,
at all fun
which
to
is
talk about.
awful, but it's not this is a
Yeah,
different
it's
issue
not at all like
entirely.
this. No,
Hmm.
no. So Disability Rights Network, when I started
Yes.
learning about this, I was shocked to see that Disability Rights Network is against compulsory treatment because, as I understand
Of
it,
any
basically
kind.
of any kind, they started out there advocating for people with all kinds of disabilities. And most disabilities are of the body and the mind is fine.
Yes.
And so basically those people are saying we should be allowed to choose our treatment, but they're taking the mental disability, in particular with when you get an illness. I mean, we're talking about psychosis. It's bipolar 1 with psychosis, paranoid schizophrenia with psychosis, schizoaffective with psycho. Yeah, that's really the unholy trinity of the hardcore,
Yes.
frequently untreated. And they're just lumping that in as though it's being in a wheelchair. And so what are, when you met with them, what were their objections?
Their objections are philosophically based, 100%. And if you kind of pull yourself out of this direct need and you try and identify with them and figure out where they're coming from,
Mhm.
what the only perspective I could really get on it was this is a philosophical argument that is absolutely rooted in all the paternalistic stuff that was
Okay.
forced on people living with a range of disabilities for many
Right.
decades. And so they have taken a completely hard line against any involuntary anything,
Right.
or treatment over any kind of objection or
So,
anything that's like that. But you're right, because none
right.
of, to my knowledge, I'm not an expert on disabilities, but to my knowledge, I cannot think of any other disability where the person who's experiencing that disability and living with it does not have insight to know that they're
Right.
living with that disability,
Right.
which is a
That's right.
critical component of this.
That's right. Sometimes jokingly, in the advocacy community, we talk about how ridiculous it would be if an ambulance pulled up to a car accident and said, okay, come on in. And people who couldn't walk because their legs were broken had to choose to get in. They said, well, the help is here. I think this person's choosing non-treatment. I mean, we all know that that's extremely silly, but when instead of the leg being broken, the brain is broken, that's what you get. And yeah, and they just don't seem able to see that. That's right. They're lumping it in with like forced sterilization.
All of that, all of that. And philosophically, they make it make sense for their
Right.
mission, for their cause, for what they're
Mhm.
trying to do. But the fact that SMI, like that does
It's different.
create a disability
Yeah,
scenario, lumps them
right.
into these issues as well, where maybe, that's not the right place
Yeah,
for
it's not,
them to
it's
be
not.
involved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that sometimes they'll go into jails and prisons and try to convince people to go off their medicines. I don't know
And
if they've
that's
actually done
like,
that, but that's
that's
a
even a
rumor that
step
I hear.
further. That's oh, that's being a zealot.
Yeah.
That's not
And
really any
right.
regard for the person's well-being.
I think that's right. In general, you find whenever there are like consumers, former patients, whatever you want to say, when they form a group and lobby against this, one of the interesting things that I've heard, and I cannot back this up, but I've had the impression that people with paranoid schizophrenia who are been successfully treated with antipsychotics are usually not the people going and doing that.
Yeah.
They are just staying at home. They're trying to hold it together. They're trying to maintain a few relationships. They are not going out. The people who go out and picket or go out and, all of the activist things, they tend to be people with much more sort of strong viewpoint disorders. I don't know, the things, they have a very strong viewpoint about what happened to them in the hospital, and they're mad about it and they don't want that to happen again. And
Yes.
I almost feel like
Yeah.
in some cases we're dealing with personality disorders. I'm sure not all of them, but some of them would be personality disorders where the medicines maybe didn't help them that much because it didn't actually, you take a medicine for this, for paranoid schizophrenia, and you give it to someone with borderline personality,
It
maybe
won't
it'll
work.
help, but it's not.
It won't. It
It's,
won't.
yeah, and so they're going to have
They've tried.
maximum side effects and minimum help, and then they're going to be difficult in the hospital and end up being put in solitary, and they're going to come out and say it was horrible. And so they tend to be very stridently against a lot of things. Interestingly, when you meet somebody with paranoid schizophrenia who was in an AOT program and got treated, you get a different view. There's one, I don't know
You
if you,
do.
yeah,
You do. You
if you
do.
met Eric Smith, went through that and did
Yeah,
so
he's
well.
lovely.
Yeah, he finished college and got a master's degree, and he's now, a consultant in these things. So he's speaking out, but it's very different. He's saying, I was given my life back.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
it's hard because even within the same person with these very chronic, very complex conditions, that cycle in and out with the treatment, if you're not adherent, if you don't stay on that or stay on
Mhm,
some modified version of
mhm,
that, but if you're not medically treated at this point, you see that like up and down where that could be the same patient that could be successful in an AOT order, is not treated, doesn't have insight into their illness, and does not want to be in a hospital against their will again, which at its face value, that makes all the sense in the world.
sure.
I don't want to be in a hospital against my will either, but we
No,
want to make
I don't
sure that
either.
they don't get there. This is something that helps them
Mhm.
not end up in the hospital with that frequency. And that's
Right,
something that's
right.
lost in a lot of these philosophical conversations.
Hmm. That's right. That's right. So that's basically, that whole thing is one of the big opponents to AOT, is that you'll get the patients groups coming out and saying, slogan, nothing about us without us.
Yeah,
Reading the,
and
and
that makes sense in that like we should hear concerns,
we
but
should, but
then there needs to be a practical view on that and say like, okay, well, if we did take your view into consideration and we implemented that view, which is the status quo right now, we have a
Mhm.
lot of people dying. We have a lot of
Yeah,
people harming other people. We have a lot of people that are just acutely suffering. And we have a lot of people in jails and prisons that should
I was going to
not
say,
be there.
nothing
So
about us without us. They aren't consulting my son.
they're not consulting your son and they're not looking, and maybe I don't think it is their space. Like, I don't think they're capable of it because it's the philosophical versus the practical matter at hand, which is people are very, very sick and they
Yeah.
need help and we're not helping them. But if you take it to its natural conclusion, it's that you would rather not intervene on behalf of somebody who needs help than intervene on behalf of somebody who needs help. And I just don't think that that's a fair
No,
argument for
no.
someone to make about somebody else. That seems really
But yeah.
like an overstep.
Okay. So what's another kind of viewpoint that was represented? Is there had to be other ones. I mean, first of all,
Yeah.
for government, it's cost. You're going to hear that
Well, it's
right off the
not.
bat.
So this is interesting. This is such a complex issue in Pennsylvania, but yes, cost is a concern to the government. Cost at the time was a very big concern because we had a Republican House and a Republican Senate. And we had Governor Wolf, but we had like two Republican chambers, and so fiscal
Okay.
conservative issues are of utmost importance.
Right.
But they
Yeah.
did the math on this, and it came back with zero fiscal note. They're both bills, the ones that were in either chamber and the bill that ultimately passed, and we have the paperwork forever on the website of the government, no cost associated with it. And the reason why is because the counties are already responsible to provide the exact same services
Yeah.
to people that need them voluntarily.
Yeah. And if you think, I think about 2012, just before all this happened, if we'd been presented with a bill for all of the doctor appointments Levi had, which somebody was, it was Medicaid or it was, something else, Resolve again, that was very expensive. I'm sure sending the mobile team out is not cheap. And so all that money was being spent. If we could have totaled it up, it seems likely to me that it would be equal to the cost. And certainly now, when he's now spent 11 years in
Right.
4 years in the Allegheny County Jail because the case moved slowly because of lawyer problems, and then in state prison, that's a lot of money. So it's just that they're not counting it.
There's a couple of misconceptions around funding in particular that I think need to be addressed in like a meaningful way if you're with people who are well-intentioned, good actors. I believe this to be true. The first misconception is that AOT is going to create a new influx of new people with
Yeah,
mental illness into the
right.
system, which is not true because those folks are already living and existing and interacting with that system.
Mhm.
Most people who are providing services in that system know the exact people that they're seeing over and over and over again. Your son was one of
Yeah,
them. These are
right.
not new
Oh,
people to the system. There's not a
right.
magic like new caseload that
Yeah,
comes
yeah.
in all of a sudden.
All the
So
cops
that's
knew him. Yeah.
yeah, that's one. Like these are currently available services that are inaccessible to someone who doesn't have insight into their illness and has a difficult time being treatment adherent. That's the difference, is that they're not coming voluntarily like your ambulance situation with
Right,
broken legs. Like
exactly. Exactly.
they can't come voluntarily right now,
Right,
but those same services are there in the ambulance to somebody who can walk into it, right? It's the
right.
same thing. That ambulance is there, the services are there. They have to be there because they're mandated to be there. And we spend a ton
AOT,
of money in Pennsylvania on these services.
AOT is the stretcher.
AOT is a stretcher. It helps get you there.
Right.
There's also this misconception that the services are different under AOT,
Mm-hmm.
but they're not. Like for the acuity, like your son should have had, based on his acuity, based on his diagnosis, but he was not able to interact with treatment to the best
Mm-hmm.
of the treatment's ability, right, to serve him.
Mm-hmm.
But he would have had a wraparound case management service and the medication plan and the treatment plan and all that stuff
If he had
is
chosen,
available to him if he had chosen to participate
right.
in it. And so they're
So,
not different services.
so again, that's where the services were there, but because he didn't think he had a problem and he just, I mean, even now, he doesn't want me to do anything for him. He just, oh no, don't say anything. No, no, don't. He would never have asked for services. But I guess you're saying, yeah, they were there. So what this is just AOT. Yeah, it's the stretcher that goes
Stretcher. I
over
like that
goes over to
analogy.
the car where the person's lying on the ground, puts them on it, and carries them to the services. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. And it's also used a lot as a step down from inpatient. So
Mhm. Right.
there's like
Right.
already service warm handoff structure in place. It's just
That's right.
ongoing support so they can live safely in the
Mhm.
community as opposed to being
Mhm.
in an inpatient setting. And then there's a lot of concern that this is gonna like flood the courts. We heard
Yeah.
that not just in Pennsylvania, but I think it's a natural um concern and
Yeah.
misconception if you don't think about how AOT actually works. But again, the
Right.
role of the court in
Right.
AOT, yes, is to be there to say like, are you on your treatment plan? How is it going? Do we need to
Yeah.
modify it? But it's also saying, hey, county, you need to be providing services to this individual. They need it, and they're under a court order to receive them, and you are under a court order to provide them. That's the thing
Right.
too. They're under a court order to provide them. And so that together creates more touch points with that individual, more of a treatment adherence, more of a, it's not really the court saying you must do this. It's the whole entirety of the thing itself that makes it work.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the courts, I've never heard of a court being like, oh, too much AOT coming in my door for me to handle this. But I don't
Yeah.
think Allegheny County would be the first either. It's typically not the courts that have a problem with this, but it is typically raised as a concern from people
So
who are not the courts themselves.
who does have a, give me another, what other kinds of people are opponents? Those are the ones that I knew about.
Those are it. I mean, we had great support from everyone at every level of government.
Really.
So the bill passed unanimously in both
Yeah, that
chambers
was that was
on the
that was
last day of session. It was like hallelujah, but
this is not Harrisburg. That's really strange.
and there was infighting between the two legislators, the one who had the House bill and the one who had the Senate version, of who was going to be the lead sponsor, because they both knew that it was very likely to pass into law, and they wanted the credit for putting this in front of the governor to sign. It was wild. Like, that's not what I expected from a political standpoint to be
Right,
happening with two
right.
Republican chambers and
Well,
Governor Wolf.
and the really strange thing is that you go from that, um, and wow, passes unanimously. Everyone's excited about it. The governor can't wait to sign it, and then nothing, absolutely nothing. So in 2018, he signed it, and there's
So
been no movement. And so, in a
awful.
sense, what I feel like happened is the all of the objections that you were dealing with have all been moved down to the county level. And so now, somewhere in Allegheny County, there are people who are making all of the same arguments. And that's some of it. I want to find out how you got around them, because maybe I can do that too. What did you do to deal with like MAD in America, disability rights, some of the other, do you have like the Basilon Center, and there's a
All
bunch,
of them.
all of them.
All of them.
What
Some
did
of them you can never get them to agree when it crosses a line into anything that is not voluntary. But what you can do is get them to agree with everything that's good up until that point. And that's the best you can ask for is, do you agree that these are the same people that would be able to receive the same services in the same
Mhm.
county if they walked in the door themselves without this extra help? Do you believe that this court order is not punitive and that there is nothing that that court can do to that person that is punitive? Do you agree with that? And there, a lot of times these people are attorneys. If you're talking to the Basilon Center, it's a philosophical argument that they're having, but you can get them to agree on the practical realities. They're not going to like it, but they didn't say anything in Pennsylvania. They didn't say anything because the practical matter is that a lot of folks are suffering,
Right,
and this is such a non-punitive way to help that is not expensive because the services already exist and have to be given to the same people with the same, even if that person has been on treatment and they can willingly go in and get voluntary services, which happens a lot of the times. The same person on an AOT order was the same person walking in voluntarily 6 months ago. They just couldn't adhere to their treatment plan, and so they need extra help in the community. But the same individual can be on an AOT order or volunteer for services because of the nature of these illnesses, and they wax and wane, and you gain insight, and then you think, I don't have to take my medicine anymore, I'm fine. And then you go off
right.
your medicine, and it
Yeah.
comes and it goes, but it can be the same person, the same human with the same symptoms and the same diagnoses in the same county. And
Mm-hmm.
you are willing to treat them voluntarily, but you say absolutely no, you get no access to this if we have to have a civil court order saying like, we are beholden to provide these services to you. That's not a good argument for anybody to make, if you ask me. And if you ask a lot of people in Pennsylvania, like there was a ton of support for this in Pennsylvania.
Interesting. No, so who supported it? Because I mean, again, this
The
is
counties ultimately supported it.
okay.
Obviously, all the political folks supported it. The Department of Health supported it. Everybody
It's so
supported
strange
it.
that it would be just dead, and then all of a sudden you find out. I mean, for all these previous years, and then all of a sudden you find out that they're all supporting it. Why didn't it pass before? I mean, you don't know the answer to that. Um, I was told at one point that there was a certain state senator that just wouldn't let it out of committee. So that's
No.
where you could have all kinds of people in favor, but that person really does have the power to just
Yeah,
stop
yeah, that's true. I think the biggest problem with any conversation moving forward was they were trying to take a law from a totally different state and just like staple it onto a world where it could never exist. Like
what kinds of things that New York was doing wouldn't work in Pennsylvania? Can you think of anything specifically?
structurally, it's just structurally. So it's the way that the law is framed out. It's the way that your courts already exist. It's the way that your mental health
Okay.
treatment system is set up. Like none of
Okay.
that is the same in New York at all as it is in
Okay.
Pennsylvania. And so you can't impose, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. It's really hard. Y- y- it's like putting a bunch of cars with their like steering wheels that are on the London side of things onto roads here. And like, yeah, you could drive, but it's gonna
Okay.
be bad. Like,
Okay.
yes, you
Okay.
could, but is
That's
that the
true.
best thing for anybody? It just doesn't really fit. It doesn't make sense,
Okay.
and it's probably
Interesting.
kind of dangerous. So it just wasn't ever gonna work. Um, you couldn't do it. You couldn't do it well. You could not implement it. This too leaves a lot of discretion up to the counties to
Want to
really
do
what they have to do at the end of the day is they have to come up with it. They have to agree to provide services. So you
Mhm.
can't court order somebody into services that don't exist.
Yeah.
That's explicit. Like you can't
Mm,
court order
right.
somebody in a county into services
Right.
that don't exist there. You have to have a provider that's willing to take that person into their care. And provider doesn't mean an individual human. It means like the provider, the system,
Okay.
Levi was going to a provider. It's a
Yes, the STEP program at UPMC would be okay. That would be
exactly,
the provider.
exactly. So somebody has to be willing to do that, which is also good. Like
Mm-hmm.
you have to have somebody that is tethered to that person's care, and you
Mm-hmm.
have to have the services existing. But if those two things exist, then there's a tailored treatment plan, including medications, including everything else, and there's a wraparound services team that's assigned to that person and is now responsible for that person's care. And it's 180 days. And then it's reviewed and it can be for another 180 days. But that amount of time seems to be
Right.
about right to get people back on track and into
So
a
yeah,
better
I was
flow.
reading before this program. I was just reading through the law and making notes, and I noticed that there's a 90-day thing and a 180-day, and then the thing of up to a year is sort of buried in the fine print. Um, and for people who have a family member that they feel may need to be on an AOT order for many years, I mean, there are people who just never accept this. I know someone on the internet whose son has been in and out of the hospital 50 times, has been in state prison and federal prison and everything in
All
between.
those things
And
would
he
allow
does
for
not believe that he has an illness.
and that sometimes unfortunately happens, but
Yeah,
that person, if AOT is appropriate for them and they don't need inpatient treatment or they're not meeting that
yeah,
criteria,
right, right.
if you meet the criteria for AOT again, you can be on another order, the petition can start, the process
So,
can start. So it's not that it's only one time ever that somebody can be on an
right,
AOT order. And in fact, AOT itself is meant to be this thing that happens multiple times to a person
right,
because of the nature of the illnesses
right.
themselves.
That's the whole point. Hospitalizations are often not long enough. Built into the I guess it was Medicaid when they first passed it in the 60s, was the institutional medical um MDB exception. I can't remember. Anyway, but
Oh,
we're basically
mental
where
disease.
mental disease, that's the D. I
Mhm.
was, yeah, okay. And where any facility that had more than 16 beds, so a specialized facility, which is where you typically want things treated, a specialized
Yeah.
facility would not be reimbursed by Medicaid if they kept the person longer than 21 days. And
Yep,
so
that exists to
that's
this
where,
day.
yeah, and that's where if you do things like this, you start finding out that 21 is a magic number, where even if it seems like, so like okay, our local Western Psychiatric Institute, they have more than 40 beds or more than 16 beds. So at the 21-day mark, the person has to be released. And they haven't even begun to realize that they're sick yet.
You know what's wild about that too is there's actually a relatively new law that passed that allows states to apply for a waiver from Medicaid to get around that.
Oh, okay.
Um, if there's some criteria, like if the average of everyone who's in one of these institutions for mental disease, which I hate that term, it's ridiculous, but just means psychiatric inpatient facility that has more than 16 beds. That's like
Mm-hmm.
what you said, the definition
Mm-hmm.
of it. But it has to be like they average out to less than a 30-day stay or 90-day stay, whatever it is. States can do and have applied for that way to get out of it. I have no idea if Pennsylvania has, but it would behoove them to.
Yeah, I don't
Um,
know either. Maybe another webinar I'll be able to find somebody who would know those things. Um
mhm.
so um so let's see. Basically, it sounds like once you went and talked to a lot of people, the answers just began emerging. And you begin sort of float a trial balloon, and you come up with a
Yeah.
structure, and then you tell it to some opponent, and they look at it and they say, okay. And so one of those things would have been the frequency of the court check-ins. The fact that
Right.
there was something that happened after 90 days, but the major one was 180 days. And that basically that what they don't want is a situation where you can quote unquote lock them up. You know,
Oh yeah, and that's not
so this is
allowed at
that would have
all.
been one of the things. Like every 6 months, there's a court review at the least.
Yeah, and this
What
is
other?
like the Court of Common Pleas, I think. I don't remember which
Yeah,
courts themselves have
yeah.
jurisdiction over
Well,
this in
and I
Pennsylvania.
wonder, I didn't see anything that said that. And I wonder if that's one of the things that the county could determine, because I feel
Mm,
like, you don't think so?
I think it's universal, and I could double check on that, but I think it's
Okay.
the Court of Common Pleas, and I feel like
Okay.
those are present in every county.
Yeah. Oh, we have a court of common pleas,
Yeah.
definitely. Um, we just have, if you take in the district courts as well, there's,
It's just not the
more of them.
criminal courts. Like
Yeah. Oh, okay, right, right. So those, yeah, I got it.
it's in a civil
That's right.
court setting, and that's of critical importance.
Right.
There are other programs that are through the criminal side of things for trying to keep folks out of jail that have mental health
Right. But
conditions,
that's,
but not in
yeah, yeah, yeah,
civil
yeah.
in its entirety.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, right. Okay. What other things do you remember that were differences between New York and the law came up with Pennsylvania to get around objections? I think you mentioned before that the some organization of emergency room physicians got
Yeah, yeah. When I was looking back on the history of this, at the very last minute, um, the ER docs came out in opposition because somebody at some point, I guess, gave them the impression that AOT would suddenly flood the emergency room with new patients experiencing mental health crises, which is, I don't know how they got there, but the department hearing them, because that's an important lobbying block, right? You don't want to
Mhm.
make the ER docs upset. So,
No,
okay,
you
we're going to
don't.
listen to you.
You
The
don't. That's
department
right.
drafted completely new AOT criteria, and they were like, how about this? This would fix the problem. And then we had to go in and say there wasn't a problem. And we talked to the ER docs, and it ended up being completely fine. It was
Yeah,
a total misunderstanding, but these things can pop up. Like,
right.
I don't know, disability rights could have called and said, hey guys, we just want to let you know this is going to go through if you guys don't intervene, but it's going to flood your emergency rooms. And then they're like, oh no, this
Oh,
is
is
going
it?
to be
Yeah.
a problem. But their emergency rooms are already flooded with people experiencing psychosis because
Oh,
we don't have hospitals for them, and we don't have
exactly.
AOT for them, and we don't have
That's
any
right.
other things for them other than jail.
You routinely
So,
hear stories of people who live in the emergency room
yes.
for weeks.
Yes.
So it's
Unacceptable.
unimaginable and unacceptable. Yeah.
Yes.
And I guess the
Nobody really opposed this other than those advocacy groups that had certain universal objections to the basic premise of this. So you
yeah,
couldn't ever get them to support something like this, but you could get them to not be so intensely opposed. And I think maybe, I don't know, I don't want to put anything on them that they didn't tell me, but maybe I like to think in the humanity of these folks who do care about people who are living with disabilities and do care about other advocacy stuff like, you know, MHA and NAMI. Those are very dedicated to caring for people with mental health conditions. I want to believe that maybe the criteria in Pennsylvania was so outrageously, dangerously, harmfully bad that maybe they thought, okay, in this world that we're in Pennsylvania, we've got it, and we might not support it, but we're not going to kick and scream and bust people into the legislature to pull this
right.
down. Because you got to think, if the entire legislature voted in favor of this, that means that there was not a lot of very vocal opposition to it in the end. And I think we did do our due diligence of talking with everybody. I
Yeah.
talked with so many different groups that don't agree with this. There was one meeting that was in the legislative offices where there was a huge conference table, and I can't even tell you everybody who was around that table, but a lot of those people did not like the fact that I was there talking to them about this. But we had a very civil conversation for a couple of hours, and to the best of my ability, I addressed all their concerns, and some things we're never going to agree on, and that's okay, but I think they did feel heard.
And the recent deterioration of civility in our public discourse hadn't
Oof.
quite happened yet. You're still in
Hadn't
2017,
quite happened yet.
a bit more of a civilized time. Um, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess the main thing that they must have focused on, sort of the last major point, is about enforcement. What happens if in Pennsylvania law, if you have somebody who's going along, let's say for the first 6 months, is cooperating, and there's a hearing, and they decide to extend it another 6 months to be on the safe side, and then all of a sudden they start noticing that his life is not going very well, and he finally admits, okay, yeah, I stopped taking my meds because I just decided, I've been putting up with this enough and I don't really need it.
Yeah.
What do they do?
Couple of things. Couple of things can happen. And an important part of AOT is you would assume too that there's such a high touch model with the ACT team, for instance, with that person, that they do see this happening at an earlier time so that they aren't completely treatment non-adherent for a long
Okay.
period to allow
Yeah.
for compensation. So that's one part, is that there's more high touch so they can see that and catch it and intervene earlier on. But what happens is, um, you will go back to the court. The providers will try their best, and if it doesn't work, they will reach out to the court. The court will have a meeting with the providers and with the person on the order, and will look at their treatment plan. Do we need a modification? What's going on here? What do we need more of? What kind of service provision is going to be more helpful? And they'll modify the treatment plan. But if that person is now meeting AOT criteria again in that moment, that first criteria that got them in, so if they have decompensated, if they're not safe in the community, if they're not all these other things, they can go in for another evaluation. So that court can order another evaluation, which is what happens at the beginning of an AOT order. You
Right.
have to be
Right.
evaluated, you have to make sure you meet criteria. And like you're going to go back into AOT again, but that leverage of having another evaluation where things are really looked at and your history is really looked at and there's conversations that are really happening, it leads to a treatment modification plan that typically is more successful. So that's like what happens.
And
And
I,
it's very successful. I don't think we really
I,
understand, we don't understand the brain enough to understand mental illness. So we certainly don't understand the brain enough to understand why that seems to work well for these folks, but it does. It's
does.
evidence-based.
And I noticed that in the law, it's talking about how a treatment team will write up an individualized plan and stuff. And there's a specific list of people that they may talk to. And it includes any individual significant to the person, including a relative, close friend, or individual otherwise concerned with their welfare,
Yeah.
or any authorized guardian. And so, in a sense, one of the things that happened with the increased privacy laws a decade or two ago is it's been 2 decades now anyway. I guess that's from the 90s. Um, it's become much harder for the family to chip in. And so what I was finding, for example, is that Levi would go to his outpatient appointment and he would just say he's doing okay, and that's not what I would be thinking at all. So the fact that the law specifies that they're allowed to talk to the family, that's really important.
It
That right
is.
there
And
would be a big thing.
yeah, and especially because like the privacy laws, HIPAA laws, I could go on and on about that for a long time. That's another conversation, but I was involved in a lot of work
Mm-hmm.
around HIPAA and how crappy that is for loved ones of people
Mm-hmm.
with serious mental illness.
Oh yeah.
But like a judge is not a covered entity. A judge, HIPAA does not apply to a judge in any capacity. That judge
Interesting.
can talk to anyone they want to in that person's family or orbit about things that they need or what's going on, and so that's another layer of kind of protection and contact and everything else. Sure, it's up to the judge's discretion. He might not want to talk to your pal Sam about your ongoing needs, but you might want to talk to your mom who
There.
you're living with and who's
Right.
providing all your care and
Right.
transportation and everything else. So that's just one extra point is yes, it's allowing for more discussion with the treatment team, but it's also like the judge can also have conversations with whomever they want to that they think is going to be helpful for this person's treatment.
I just hope we get a chance to try it out. That's
I
right.
will help however I can because I mean,
Mhm.
I've moved on to a couple jobs since TAC, but like I
Mhm.
said, TAC is still the most important work I've ever done and it sits in my soul
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I will help literally however I can. This is very important to me and after everything that's gone on in
Mhm.
Pennsylvania and everything that's
Mhm.
happened with your family,
Mhm. Mhm.
and a lot of other families there, I just can't it can't stand and we can't have gotten this
Yeah.
far without any implementation.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I will
I just
help.
every time I go back to, in sentencing my son, the judge specifically said, and I bought the transcript so that I could go back and look at it. She specifically said, I could give you as little as 60 months. It was basically 5 years, yeah, 60 months in prison, which would have given him maybe another year, including time served, and then he would have been transitioning into hospital and community care. But then she went on and she said, but I don't think you would stay on medicine. And there isn't any program right now that would make you. So I'm going to sentence you in the standard range, 10 to 20. And suddenly here was someone I mean, the prosecutor speaking against him in court began by saying, this is a heartbreaking case. Everybody knew exactly what this was. There was none of the criminal evil stuff. He literally just was not forced to take medicine for so long until he believed he was doing a good thing. He
You
believed
believe he was doing a good
a good thing.
thing.
That's right. He believed that the police, when they took him in, they were going to realize that they'd made a mistake and they would let him go. Because,
Yep.
we have lots of movies about people who have to do something that looks bad, but see, they know the secret. And the classic setup where you have not only the bad guys are after the hero, but so are the police. Because the
Yes.
police just don't understand how important this is. We use that in movies all the time, and that's the way he saw it. That's the way he saw it. And so anyway, lost this is this is why I need to avoid my story when I need to talk about objective things.
I don't
Um,
think you can avoid your story because none of this is objective. That's the
it
thing. This
isn't,
is all
yeah,
very
yeah.
personal. This is all
So
very real.
anyway, so basically she decided that the prison should be his health care for 20 years. And I did not know yet how reasonable or unreasonable that was. She said, trust me, he'll get health care there. Well, I know everybody, in all situations, most people are trying to do their best, right? And that's a fact. Um, but what really shocked me was when he went into the state system, he goes in with the label guilty but mentally ill, GBMI.
I
He's
really hate that
I
plea, by
do
the way.
too. I do too, trust me. And he's placed in a very nice prison out in the country in a block entirely with GBMI. They've got nurse, they've got all the healthcare there. But you know what they didn't have? Even there, you'd think that somebody who killed someone for being delusional was labeled mentally ill by the court, was sent to a prison where they have control over everything he does, everything he eats, and in a block, especially for those, still nobody had to take their meds. And at first he was telling me this, he just couldn't believe it either. He said, Mom, fights break out, and basically someone would get into a fight, they'd break up the fight, they'd take the people away, you wouldn't see them for a few weeks, because basically they'd have them in a solitary confinement, and they'd say, listen, you need to be on your meds, and then the person will come back. Eventually during I think I'm piecing it together because there was no communication, but I think that during the pandemic lockdown, the prisons all stopped having things like the mess hall and classes and work. He
Right.
didn't do that much of those things because of being autistic. He just kind of stayed to himself. But when all of that was shut down, I think he started doing a lot worse. And he decided he didn't need meds. And I didn't hear from him for 2 years. And it was very hard because the prison wouldn't tell me much. It's not like school where they send you reports or tell you anything.
Right.
They don't have,
Right. No, it's a black box.
it's a
Like
black
the
box. Yeah, yeah. And this is what I'm thinking, I learned in Levi's trial that um, as high as 25% of the autistic kids growing up now with their IEPs and their special services and all that, they as high as a quarter of them may develop paranoid schizophrenia. And the same thing happened. And their parents are not going to want to be told, oh, by the way, you just have to wait for something bad to happen. Hope it's
no.
not too bad. No, they're not going to like that. And then to find out that after something bad does happen, then they're like, but the insanity defense. I've got a that's written up on my website, what I think of that, and since that's another conversation. But effectively, Pennsylvania does not have an insanity defense. And then finally, they get into this, and they're still not required. So Levi ended up being transferred to the one place in the system that will make you take your meds. And that's where he is now. And because of the way it's set up, what's heartbreaking is that the prison he was in, they now have a special autism unit that he should have been in. But
I
because
mean,
but
there's
because they had to send him away because they couldn't convince him to take his medicine and they couldn't make him take his medicine, he got sent to the other side of the state where they have all kinds of programs, but in order to be in them, you have to be willing to live in a kind of a like a barracks setting with many people in the room, and he can't handle that. So the only place he could be that have to have a cell to himself and not have people in his face picking on him and stuff is to go back to a more restricted area where he's in a cell. It's exactly, it's not like the barracks thing, the things like, oh, they can raise guide dog puppies. There's all kinds of things, ideas in the prisons. That's out,
yeah,
that thing, that's out there. But he, as an autistic person, could not handle being in, literally, it's like they have a room housing like 40 people and they have dividers splitting it into four smaller with like 8 to 10 beds in each one. And he couldn't handle that. And so where he is, there really isn't very much. And so he just sits there and he just paces and paces and paces.
Ruth,
And
I
so,
think we need to have a specific focus on a specific conversation as
mhm.
part of your series that is about all the different policy levers that can be pushed and pulled in that space, because none of that's normal.
You know what? You
Like
know what?
there's
I
other
don't,
places that
all I,
don't do that, as
all
far
I,
as medication over objection is concerned.
all I can say is it's not like the school. It's a black box, and don't even try to complain. When I've asked questions, there's a counselor assigned him. I've asked questions, and a week later, Levi will contact me and say, Mom, don't do that again. Why?
We've got to,
Obviously they gave him grief. So it's just not good. And anyway,
we've
people,
got to do better. We've got to do better.
if through these conversations, I had somebody contact me and say, hey, I'd like to help, that would be great. Because at the moment, I've knocked on this door and pushed on that one and ended up basically agreeing to my son that I will just leave it alone, because he's terrified of where he is. He's so terrified, he doesn't even perceive that he's terrified. He just acts terrified. I mean, when you won't leave your cell to go to the library, you're terrified. And it's become just the way he just exists. And so he'll say, no, I'm not afraid. I just haven't gone yet. Say each week, have you gone to the library? No, no. Have you talked to anybody? No. Have you gone outside? No. Have you done this? No. Have you done that? No. Anyway, with the autistic kids growing up, Levi was at the oldest age group of them. We're going to have more people coming into the system who do that, who aren't caught and medicated in time, and they freak out and something tragic happens and they're in the prison. Their parents are not going to like this. We need an option where you don't have to wait for danger.
I could not agree more, and I
Bottom
want to
line.
help get this
Yep.
implemented.
Yep. Yep.
Let's do that.
Absolutely. Well, so we're going to wrap this up, and then I mean, obviously I'm just getting started on these things. I'm a beginner, but people in the family are going to start trying to be a production team, and we're going to turn this into a video, the whole video as well as sections, and get that put up and make more. And we're just going to just keep working on that. So I hope that those watching enjoyed this and learned as much as I did. So let me just check if there were any questions submitted. Don't have any questions.
Glad you did this, Ruth. Like, we need to start talking about this again. It's been long enough where
Yeah,
implementation should have happened and it's not. So
and it's not.
we need a little nudge. We need a little push.
I know.
And
And it's all
that's
I
going to
can.
take people talking about it.
That's right. That's right. And you just got to get people talking.
And we
So,
will.
and we
And we
will.
will. And I will help however I can. And I know you've got a lot of other people who will help however they
I
can.
hope
And
so. I
we
hope
will
so.
help
This
you.
is
We
this
will help
tends
you.
it tends to be a pretty lonely crusade.
It does. And you know what? I don't want it to be. So
No,
we're going to help.
no. Okay, that's great. I'm not going to give up regardless, because
I know you
there's
won't.
only one of him. And it's so easy when you don't actually know the person to just assume all kinds of things about them being bad. But this was my Asperger's little professor who liked to tell everybody about how lift worked with an airplane. Little toddler going, have you heard of the Bernoulli effect? That was my little professor. And he's in a prison cell now where he isn't allowed to do most things, and he's just wilting. And so I'm not going to give up.
I'm not going to give up either.
All right. Thank you, Frankie, for coming again.
Thank you, Ruth, for doing this.
My website, www. Some point we're going to get to stop saying those W's, aren't we? Why couldn't they have picked a simpler letter instead of the longest name? www. All right. AOT for AlleghenyCounty.com. That's four spelled as a word, not a number. AOT for AlleghenyCounty.com. Contact me, and tune in for the next one next week. All right.
Thanks, Ruth.
Bye-bye.